Marcus Chen had been driving taxi number 47 through the busy streets of San Francisco for 8 years. Every morning at 5 a.m., he would climb into his yellow Crown Victoria, adjust the rearview mirror, and begin another day of navigating the city's steep hills and crowded intersections. To his passengers, he was just another cab driver, polite, quiet, and reliable. The other drivers at Yellow Cab Company knew very little about Marcus. He kept to himself during breaks, sipping coffee from a thermos while reading paperback novels. When the younger drivers complained about difficult passengers or bad traffic, Marcus would simply nod and offer a gentle smile. He never joined their conversations about sports or weekend plans. There was something different about him, but nobody could put their finger on what it was. Marcus lived alone in a small apartment in the Richmond district. The walls were mostly bare except for a few landscape photographs and a single framed picture that sat on his nightstand. A group photo of men in military uniforms standing beside what looked like aircraft. Visitors were rare and Marcus preferred it that way. His routine was simple: work, eat, sleep, repeat. On Tuesday mornings, Marcus would always stop at Ocean Beach before his shift. He would sit in his car watching the waves crash against the shore, drinking coffee and eating a simple breakfast. The ocean seemed to calm him in a way that nothing else could. Sometimes, when the fog was thick and low, he would close his eyes and listen to the sound of the waves. During these moments, his hands would unconsciously move as if gripping a control stick, making tiny adjustments that only he understood. The passengers who rode in Marcus's taxi came from all walks of life. Business executives heading to downtown meetings, tourists excited to see the Golden Gate Bridge, families rushing to catch flights at the airport. Marcus treated each passenger with the same quiet courtesy. He knew the fastest routes through the city, could navigate around construction and accidents without GPS, and never lost his patience even in the worst traffic jams. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who took Marcus's taxi to her doctor appointments every month, often tried to start conversations with him. "You seem like you have stories to tell," she would say from the back seat. "Have you always driven a taxi?" Marcus would glance at her in the rearview mirror and simply reply, "Not always, but it's good work." He never elaborated. No matter how much she pushed, there were small signs that Marcus was different from other cab drivers, but most people didn't notice. His posture was always perfectly straight. His movements were precise and deliberate, and he had an unusual way of scanning his surroundings, constantly checking mirrors, noting other vehicles, and seeming to process information about everything happening around him. When emergency vehicles rushed past with sirens blaring, Marcus would pull over with a smoothness and timing that suggested extensive training. One particularly busy Friday evening, Marcus picked up a young couple near Union Square. They were arguing loudly about directions to a restaurant, both insisting they knew the best way to get there. As their voices grew louder and more heated, Marcus calmly adjusted his mirror and said, "Sometimes when people are under stress, they forget that there are many ways to reach the same destination. The important thing is staying focused on what matters most." His voice was steady and authoritative in a way that surprised even him. The couple fell silent, and for the rest of the ride they spoke in whisper. The dispatcher at Yellow Cab, Janet Miller, had worked there for 15 years and prided herself on knowing all the drivers. Marcus puzzled her more than any of the others. He never called in sick, never complained about his assigned routes, and never seemed rattled by anything that happened during his shifts. "That guy has ice water in his veins," she would tell the other dispatchers. "Nothing bothers him." Marcus's apartment was as organized as his driving routine. Everything had its place, from his neatly folded clothes to his small collection of books about aviation history. The refrigerator held simple meals that he prepared on Sundays for the entire week. His bed was made every morning with military precision, corners tight and covers smooth. The only disorder in his life seemed to be in his dreams, where he would often find himself in the cockpit of an aircraft, surrounded by clouds and endless sky. During his lunch breaks, Marcus would sometimes park near the marina and watch small planes taking off from the nearby airport. His eyes would track their movements with the intensity of someone who understood every aspect of flight. Other drivers assumed he was just killing time, but there was something almost wistful in the way he watched those aircraft climb into the sky. The customers who rode regularly with Marcus began to request him specifically. Hotel concierge knew they could count on him to get their guests to the airport on time, even during rush hour. Restaurant managers would call Yellow Cab and ask for the quiet driver with the steady hands. Marcus had built a reputation without ever trying to promote himself. One rainy evening in November, Marcus picked up a businessman at a downtown hotel. The man was clearly nervous about catching a red-eye flight, checking his watch every few minutes and asking repeatedly if they would make it on time. As they navigated through heavy traffic on the 101, Marcus noticed the man's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. Without taking his eyes off the road, Marcus began speaking in a calm, measured voice about breathing techniques he had learned somewhere along the way. By the time they reached the airport, the businessman was relaxed and grateful. As Marcus drove through the city each day, he carried with him a past that nobody suspected. His steady hands had once controlled more than just a steering wheel, and his calm demeanor had been forged in circumstances far more challenging than San Francisco traffic. But for now, he was content to be just another taxi driver, helping people get from one place to another, one fare at a time. The city moved around him in its familiar rhythm, and Marcus moved with it, invisible and essential, carrying his secrets as carefully as he carried his passengers. Marcus Chen had not always been a taxi driver. 12 years earlier, he had been Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen, one of the Navy's most skilled fighter pilots. He had flown FA-18 Super Hornets from aircraft carriers across 3 different oceans, logged over 2,000 flight hours, and earned commendations for his exceptional flying abilities and cool decision-making under pressure. His journey to the cockpit had begun in college, where he studied aerospace engineering while participating in the Navy ROTC program. Marcus had always been drawn to the precision and challenge of aviation. While other students spent their weekends at parties, Marcus could be found at the local airfield, volunteering to help maintain small aircraft just to be around planes. His instructors quickly recognized his natural aptitude for understanding complex flight systems and his unusual ability to remain calm in high-stress situations. After graduation, Marcus entered Navy flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola. The program was grueling, designed to push candidates to their limits and beyond. Many of his classmates dropped out, unable to handle the intense physical and mental demands. Marcus not only survived but excelled. His instructors noted his exceptional spatial awareness, his ability to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, and his steady hands that never trembled, even during the most challenging maneuvers. During his active duty years, Marcus served on the USS Theodore Roosevelt and later the USS Gerald R. Ford. He flew missions over various conflict zones, providing air support and conducting reconnaissance operations. His fellow pilots respected him not just for his flying skills, but for his leadership during crisis situations. Marcus had an unusual gift for keeping his squadron calm when things went wrong. During one particularly dangerous mission over the Persian Gulf, when his wingman's aircraft suffered engine failure, Marcus talked him through an emergency landing procedure while coordinating with the carrier's flight deck crew. His steady voice and clear instructions had saved both the pilot and a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Life aboard an aircraft carrier had shaped Marcus in ways that civilian life could never erase. He learned to function on minimal sleep, to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, and to trust his instincts even when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise. The constant awareness required for carrier operations, where a single mistake could result in catastrophic consequences, became second nature to him. Marcus's specialty was precision flying in challenging conditions. He could land an FA-18 on a carrier deck in rough seas and limited visibility when other pilots would abort their approach. During training exercises, he was often assigned to test new emergency procedures because his instructors knew he could handle equipment failures and unexpected situations better than almost anyone else in his squadron. The framed photograph on Marcus's nightstand showed his squadron after completing a successful 6-month deployment. They had been through intense situations together, forming bonds that Marcus thought would last forever. In the photo, Marcus stood in the back row, his expression serious but confident, surrounded by the men and women who had become his military family. Everything changed during what should have been a routine training flight off the coast of California. Marcus was leading a formation of 4 aircraft when his radar detected an unidentified aircraft in restricted airspace. Following protocol, he attempted to make radio contact while maneuvering his formation to intercept. What happened next would haunt Marcus for years to come. The unidentified aircraft turned out to be a small civilian plane that had wandered off course. The pilot was an elderly man taking his granddaughter on her first flight, completely unaware that he had entered military airspace. When Marcus's squadron approached, the civilian pilot panicked and made an erratic turn directly into the path of one of the Navy aircraft. Marcus watched helplessly as his wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Williams, tried to avoid the collision. She managed to miss the civilian plane, but her evasive maneuver sent her aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Marcus immediately broke formation and followed her down, talking her through emergency procedures over the radio. For agonizing minutes, he coached her through every possible recovery technique, his voice never wavering despite the terror he felt watching his friend's aircraft plummet toward the ocean. Sarah's ejection seat malfunctioned. Marcus was close enough to see her struggling with the manual release as her aircraft continued its deadly spiral. He made a split-second decision that violated every safety protocol he had ever learned. Marcus flew his own aircraft dangerously close to Sarah's spinning fighter, close enough that the wash from his engines might help stabilize her plane, or at least give her a few more seconds to escape. The maneuver didn't work. Marcus watched Sarah's aircraft hit the water at high speed. The search and rescue operation that followed recovered her body 3 days later. The official investigation concluded that Marcus had followed correct procedures, and that Sarah's death was the result of equipment failure combined with an unavoidable accident. Marcus was cleared of any wrongdoing and even received a commendation for his attempt to save his wingman. But Marcus knew the truth that the investigation had missed. In those final seconds when he should have been focused entirely on Sarah's emergency, part of his attention had been diverted by concern for the civilian aircraft and its innocent passengers. That momentary split in focus, lasting no more than 2 or 3 seconds, might have cost him precious time in recognizing the full severity of Sarah's situation. The civilian plane landed safely at a nearby airport. The grandfather and his granddaughter never knew how close they had come to disaster, or that a young Navy pilot had died protecting them. Marcus never tried to contact them, never wanted to know their names. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing their faces or hearing their gratitude. Marcus completed his tour of duty and fulfilled his military commitment, but the joy had gone out of flying. Every time he climbed into a cockpit, he thought about Sarah. Every landing reminded him of the last time he had seen her alive. His performance reviews remained excellent, but his squadron mates noticed the change in him. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made others uncomfortable. When his enlistment ended, Marcus shocked his superiors by declining to re-enlist. He had been offered promotion and choice assignments, with a clear path to becoming a squadron commander. Instead, he quietly left the Navy and disappeared into civilian life. His former commanding officer tried to convince him to reconsider, arguing that the Navy needed experienced pilots like Marcus. But Marcus had made his decision. He moved to San Francisco because it was far from any major naval installations. He chose taxi driving because it let him help people get safely from one place to another, without the life-and-death stakes he had known in the military. The simple act of delivering passengers to their destinations became a kind of quiet redemption, a way to use his skills for purely positive purposes. Marcus never spoke about his military service to anyone. He legally changed his name from Marcus Chen Williams. He had hyphenated his name to honor Sarah after her death, back to simply Marcus Chen. He wanted to leave that part of his life buried in the past, along with the memories that still woke him up some nights in a cold sweat. Thursday morning started like any other day for Marcus. The fog hung thick over San Francisco Bay as he performed his usual pre-shift inspection of Taxi 47. He checked the tire pressure, tested the lights, and cleaned the windshield with the methodical precision that had become second nature. The weather forecast called for clear skies by afternoon, with winds from the west at 15 knots, details that most people wouldn't notice, but Marcus's mind automatically processed and filed away. At 6:30 a.m., Marcus received his first call from dispatch. A businessman needed to get to SFO Airport for an early flight to Seattle. As Marcus navigated through the morning traffic, He listened to the radio chatter between drivers and noticed an unusual number of emergency vehicles moving through the city. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars seemed to be heading in the same general direction, toward the downtown area near the financial district. The passenger, Mr. Harrison, was nervous about missing his flight and kept checking his phone for updates. "There's something going on downtown," he said, showing Marcus a news alert. "Some kind of emergency at one of the office buildings. I hope it doesn't affect traffic to the airport." Marcus glanced at the phone screen and saw a brief headline about an incident at the Meridian Tower, a 40-story office building that housed several major financial firms. After dropping off Mr. Harrison at the airport, Marcus decided to take a different route back into the city. His curiosity about the emergency situation wasn't just idle interest. Years of military training had taught him to gather information about developing situations that might affect his operations. What he saw as he approached downtown made his stomach tighten with familiar tension. The Meridian Tower was partially obscured by thick black smoke billowing from somewhere around the 20th floor. Fire department ladder trucks surrounded the building, their extended ladders reaching up like desperate fingers trying to touch the sky. Marcus could see people gathered on the sidewalks, some in business suits, others in the uniforms of emergency responders. The organized chaos of a major incident was unfolding before his eyes. Marcus parked his taxi several blocks away and walked closer to get a better view. The scene reminded him uncomfortably of emergency situations he had witnessed from aircraft carriers. The urgent movement of personnel, the careful coordination of resources, the underlying tension that came with lives hanging in the balance. He could hear radio traffic from nearby police cars and fire trucks, fragments of communication that painted a picture of a serious situation still developing. A fire department spokesperson was giving an interview to news crews that had gathered near the command post. Marcus positioned himself where he could overhear the briefing. The fire had started on the 19th floor due to an electrical malfunction in the building's main server room. The flames had spread quickly through the ventilation system, and thick smoke was filling the upper floors. Most of the building had been evacuated, but approximately 150 people were trapped on floors 25 through 35. Above the fire and smoke, the real problem, Marcus learned from listening to the radio chatter, was that the building's main stairwells were filled with smoke, making evacuation impossible. The elevators had been automatically shut down as a safety measure. The fire department's ladder trucks could only reach the 15th floor, and their helicopter was grounded due to the thick smoke and debris being carried by the wind. Marcus watched the faces of the firefighters and emergency coordinators. He recognized the expression of professionals who were running out of good options. They were doing everything they could with the resources available, but the situation was deteriorating faster than they could respond to it. The wind was picking up, spreading the smoke and making visibility even worse for any potential aerial rescue. On the higher floors of the building, Marcus could see people at windows, some waving frantically, others holding up signs asking for help. The sight triggered memories he had tried to bury. Other desperate faces, other impossible situations where lives depended on someone making the right decision under pressure. His hands began to shake slightly, a reaction he hadn't experienced in years. Marcus tried to walk away, telling himself that this wasn't his responsibility. He was just a taxi driver now. He had left behind the world where he was expected to fly into danger to save others. But as he headed back toward his taxi, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. Looking up, Marcus saw a Coast Guard helicopter circling the area. The pilot was clearly trying to assess the situation, but the dense smoke and urban environment were making it nearly impossible to get close to the building. Marcus could see the aircraft, struggling with the unpredictable wind currents created by the combination of the fires, heat, and the tall buildings surrounding the tower. Marcus found himself analyzing the helicopter's movements with professional interest. The pilot was skilled but seemed unfamiliar with the specific challenges of urban rescue operations in heavy smoke. The aircraft was maintaining too much distance from the building, probably following standard safety protocols that didn't account for the unique conditions they were facing. A news reporter standing nearby was talking into her microphone, explaining to viewers that rescue efforts were being hampered by the smoke and wind conditions. "The Coast Guard helicopter is on scene," she said. but they're having difficulty getting close enough to the building to attempt any kind of rescue operation. Fire department officials say they're running out of time to reach the people trapped on the upper floors. Marcus checked his watch. It was now 10:45 a.m., and the fire had been burning for over 2 hours. The longer those people remained trapped, the more dangerous their situation became. Carbon monoxide poisoning, extreme heat, and structural damage were all becoming more serious threats with each passing minute. As Marcus stood there watching the emergency unfold, his mind began working in ways it hadn't for 8 years. He started calculating wind patterns, evaluating approach vectors, and considering the specific challenges that would face any pilot attempting a rescue in these conditions. Despite his efforts to suppress them, his military instincts were reasserting themselves. The Coast Guard helicopter made another approach toward the building, but was forced to pull away when a gust of wind caught it in the smoke plume. Marcus could see that the pilot was being cautious, probably the right decision for normal operations, but potentially catastrophic in a situation where time was running out for the trapped people. Marcus walked closer to the fire department command post, where he could hear radio communications more clearly. The incident commander was discussing options with his staff, and none of them sounded promising. The building's structure was beginning to weaken from the heat, and there were concerns that the upper floors might become unstable within the next hour. "We need someone who can get that helicopter in close enough to extract people from the roof," one of the fire officials was saying. "But these wind conditions and all this smoke, it's like flying blind." Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he had thought was buried forever. It was the feeling he used to get when facing an impossible mission, a combination of fear, determination, and absolute clarity about what needed to be done. For the first time in 8 years, Marcus Chen began to consider the possibility that there might be situations where walking away simply wasn't an option. By 11:30 a.m., the situation at the Meridian Tower had become critical. Marcus watched from his position near the command post as the fire department's attempts to reach the trapped people continued to fail. The smoke had grown thicker and more toxic, and reports from the building indicated that several people on the upper floors were showing signs of smoke inhalation. The Coast Guard helicopter had made 3 more attempts to approach the building, but each time the pilot was forced to retreat due to dangerous wind conditions and near-zero visibility. Marcus could see the frustration on the faces of the emergency responders. They were highly trained professionals doing everything by the book, but the book didn't have answers for this particular combination of challenges. A new development made the situation even more urgent. The building's fire suppression system had failed on the upper floors, and the structural engineers on scene were reporting that the steel framework was beginning to weaken from the intense heat. The trapped people had perhaps 30 minutes before the building became too unstable for any rescue attempt. Marcus moved closer to where the Coast Guard helicopter crew was huddled with fire department officials. The pilot, a young man who looked to be in his early 30s, was explaining the challenges he was facing. "The smoke is creating zero visibility conditions," he said. "And the wind shear around these tall buildings is unpredictable. Every time I try to get close enough to hover near the roof, I'm getting hit with downdrafts that could slam us into the building." The incident commander, Fire Chief Patricia Sullivan, was clearly under enormous pressure. "We've got 150 people up there," she said. "Some of them are already unconscious from smoke inhalation. If we can't get them out in the next 20 minutes, we're going to lose them." Marcus found himself studying the Coast Guard pilot's approach pattern and flight techniques. The young man was competent in following proper safety procedures, but he lacked the experience needed for this type of extreme rescue operation. Marcus could see mistakes in his approach angles and timing that were making an already dangerous situation even more difficult. What the pilot needed, Marcus realized, was someone who understood how to fly in impossible conditions, someone who had experience making precision approaches in limited visibility with unpredictable wind patterns, someone who had learned to land aircraft on moving carrier decks in rough seas with no margin for error. Marcus tried to push these thoughts away. This wasn't his problem anymore. He had walked away from this kind of responsibility 8 years ago, and he had good reasons for doing so. But as he watched the clock tick toward the deadline, he kept thinking about the 150 people trapped above the fire, including children who had been visiting their parents' offices on what was supposed to be a routine school holiday. The news crews were broadcasting live updates, and Marcus could see people gathered around television screens in nearby buildings, watching the drama unfold. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if the emergency responders could pull off a miracle. At 11:45 a.m., disaster struck. The Coast Guard helicopter was making another approach when a sudden gust of wind and a thick cloud of smoke caused the pilot to lose his bearings. Marcus watched in horror as the aircraft tilted dangerously toward the building, before the pilot managed to pull away at the last second. The near miss had shaken the crew's confidence, and Marcus could see that they were unlikely to attempt another approach. Chief Sullivan was on her radio, requesting additional helicopter support from other agencies, but the response was discouraging. The California Highway Patrol's helicopters were already committed to other emergencies, and the military aircraft at nearby bases would take at least an hour to arrive and get briefed on the situation. An hour they didn't have. Marcus stood at the edge of the command area, watching emergency personnel struggle with an impossible situation. His mind was automatically calculating solutions, approach vectors that would minimize exposure to wind shear, techniques for maintaining position reference in zero visibility, methods for executing rapid extractions in hazardous conditions. Everything he had learned during his military service was telling him exactly how this rescue could be accomplished, but it would require a pilot with very specific experience and skills. It would require someone willing to violate standard safety protocols and push aircraft performance to its absolute limits. It would require someone who had trained for situations where failure wasn't just unacceptable, it was unthinkable. A young paramedic ran up to Chief Sullivan with an update from inside the building. "Chief, we're getting reports that people on the 32nd floor are starting to collapse from carbon monoxide poisoning. The structural engineers say we've got maybe 15 minutes before the building becomes too unstable for operations." Marcus watched Chief Sullivan's face as she processed this information. She was a veteran firefighter who had seen countless emergencies, but this situation was beyond anything her department had ever faced. She needed options and she was running out of them fast. That's when Marcus made his decision. He walked directly up to Chief Sullivan, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since his last combat mission. "Chief Sullivan," he said in a clear, steady voice that carried the authority he had once used to command a squadron of fighter pilots. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm a former Navy pilot with extensive experience in precision flight operations under extreme conditions. I believe I can help you with that helicopter." Chief Sullivan looked at him with surprise and skepticism. "Sir, I appreciate your offer, but we're dealing with a very dangerous situation here. Our Coast Guard pilot is highly trained." "He's trained for normal operations," Marcus interrupted gently. "This isn't normal. What you need is someone with experience flying in impossible conditions. Carrier landings and storms, combat rescue operations, precision flying in zero visibility. I have over 2,000 hours in military aircraft and specialized training in urban rescue techniques." The Coast Guard pilot, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, had overheard the conversation and approached them. "With all due respect, sir," he said to Marcus, "this is an extremely complex operation. The wind conditions alone are similar to landing on a carrier deck in a North Atlantic storm," Marcus finished. "The visibility issues are comparable to flying through smoke from oil fires during combat operations, and the precision required for extraction is something I practiced hundreds of times during search and rescue training." Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out his military identification card, which he had kept despite his desire to forget his past. "Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen, retired, former squadron leader with specialized training in emergency rescue operations. I've flown missions in conditions that would ground most civilian aircraft." Chief Sullivan studied the ID card, then looked at Marcus with new attention. "Even if you have the experience, Lieutenant Commander, that's not our helicopter. The Coast Guard would have to approve any change in pilots. And there's no time—" "Chief," Lieutenant Morrison interrupted, "if Commander Chen has the experience he claims, and if he's willing to take responsibility for the operation, I'm willing to step aside. I know my limitations and this situation is beyond them. Those people up there need someone who can do things I can't do." Marcus felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was a feeling he had tried to forget, but it fit him like an old uniform that still knew his exact measurements. For 8 years he had avoided situations where other people's lives depended on his decisions. Now he was about to put himself directly back into that position. I'll need 5 minutes to inspect the aircraft and review the operational parameters, Marcus said. And I'll need someone who can coordinate ground support and provide real-time updates on wind conditions and building stability. Chief Sullivan looked at her watch. They had 12 minutes left before the building became too dangerous for rescue operations. She made her decision with the speed of someone who had spent her career making life-and-death choices under pressure. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," she said, "the helicopter is yours." Marcus climbed into the Coast Guard helicopter with the fluid movement of someone returning to a familiar environment. The aircraft was an MH-65 Dolphin, smaller and lighter than the military helicopters he had trained on, but the basic principles were the same. His hands automatically found the controls as muscle memory from thousands of flight hours took over. Lieutenant Morrison briefed him quickly on the aircraft's specific systems and limitations. "She's got about 40 minutes of fuel remaining," he said. "The rescue hoist can handle up to 6 people at a time, but in these wind conditions I'd recommend no more than 4. The smoke is going to make instrument flying essential. You won't be able to see the building until you're almost on top of it." Marcus nodded, already running through the approach procedures in his mind. "I'll need someone on the ground to talk me through the final approach," he said. "Someone who can see the building structure and give me real-time updates on wind conditions at rooftop level." Chief Sullivan assigned her best spotter, Captain Mike Rodriguez, to coordinate from the ground. Rodriguez had experience guiding aerial operations and understood the critical importance of precise communication. He positioned himself with a clear view of the building's roof and established radio contact with Marcus. At 11:52 a.m., Marcus lifted off. The helicopter rose smoothly into the smoky air, and immediately he could feel the challenging wind conditions that had defeated the previous pilot. Gusts from different directions hit the aircraft as it climbed, and the thick smoke made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Marcus's training kicked in automatically. He transitioned to instrument flying, using the aircraft's navigation systems and Rodriguez's ground guidance to navigate toward the building. "Dragon 1. This is ground control." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "You're approaching from the southwest. Wind is gusting to 30 knots from multiple directions. Visibility at rooftop level is near zero. The roof access door is on the north side of the building." Marcus acknowledged the transmission and began his approach. The technique he used was something he had learned during carrier landings, maintaining precise control inputs while processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. He monitored the aircraft's position, altitude, and attitude while listening to Rodriguez's guidance and feeling the helicopter's responses to the chaotic wind patterns. "Dragon 1, you're 50 feet from the building," Rodriguez reported. "There are people visible on the roof. Looks like about 20 in the first group. They're staying low due to the smoke." Marcus couldn't see the building yet, but he could sense its presence through the way the wind patterns were changing. The massive structure was creating its own microclimate of air currents, made worse by the heat rising from the fire below. He adjusted his approach angle slightly, using techniques he had developed for landing on aircraft carriers in rough weather. Suddenly, the building's rooftop appeared through the smoke like a ship emerging from fog. Marcus could see people huddled near the roof access door, some lying down, others helping to support those who were overcome by smoke inhalation. The sight reminded him painfully of rescue operations he had conducted during his military service. But he pushed those memories aside and focused on the immediate task. The helicopter's rescue specialist, Petty Officer Sarah Kim, was ready with the hoist system. "Commander, I can see the survivors," she reported. "Some of them appear to be unconscious. We need to move fast." Marcus brought the helicopter into a hover about 30 feet above the rooftop. The aircraft shook violently as wind gusts hit it from different angles, but Marcus's hands on the controls remained steady. He was using micro-adjustments learned from hundreds of carrier landings, making constant tiny corrections to keep the helicopter in position despite the chaotic air currents. "Deploying rescue basket," Kim announced. The hoist system lowered the rescue basket toward the roof, but the wind immediately began pushing it away from the survivors. Marcus adjusted the helicopter's position to compensate, moving the aircraft with a precision that amazed even Rodriguez on the ground. The first group of survivors included 2 children and 2 adults who were barely conscious from smoke inhalation. Kim guided them into the rescue basket with hand signals, as verbal communication was nearly impossible over the noise of the helicopter and the wind. Marcus held the hover with mechanical precision, never allowing the aircraft to drift more than a few feet, despite the violent air currents trying to push them away from the building. The first extraction took 8 minutes, longer than normal due to the conditions, but Marcus knew that rushing would be more dangerous than taking the time to do it right. As soon as the survivors were secured in the helicopter, he flew them to the designated landing zone where medical personnel were waiting. Ground control, Dragon 1 returning for second group. Marcus radioed as he turned back toward the building. How many more people on the roof? Dragon 1, we count approximately 30 more survivors visible on the roof, Rodriguez replied. But the building engineers are reporting increasing structural instability. They're recommending that all rescue operations cease within the next 10 minutes. Marcus acknowledged the time constraint, but didn't let it affect his flying. He had learned long ago that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in these conditions would be fatal. He approached the building for the second time, using the same methodical technique that had worked before. This extraction was more challenging because the remaining survivors included several people who were unconscious and had to be carefully loaded into the rescue basket. Marcus held the helicopter in position for 12 agonizing minutes while Kim and the survivors on the roof worked to secure everyone safely. The wind seemed to be getting worse, and Marcus could feel the helicopter being pushed around more violently with each passing minute. Dragon 1, structural engineers are reporting critical stress levels, Rodriguez warned. You need to know that the building could become unstable at any moment. Marcus had been in situations before where the mission parameters changed mid-operation. His response was the same now as it had been during his military service. Acknowledge the new information and continue with the mission until it was complete or impossible to continue. The second group of survivors was airlifted to safety, but there were still more people trapped inside the building who had managed to reach the roof access stairs, but couldn't get the door open due to smoke and debris. Marcus could see them through a small window in the stairwell. About 15 people, including what appeared to be several elderly individuals and children. Ground control. I can see more survivors in the roof access stairwell, Marcus reported. They can't get the door open. We need to extract them directly from that location. This would require a much more dangerous maneuver. Hovering the helicopter close enough to the building that Kim could use the rescue hoist to extract people directly from the stairwell window. It was the kind of operation that violated several safety protocols and required flying skills that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with obvious concern. Dragon 1, that puts you within 10 feet of the building. In these wind conditions, that's extremely dangerous. Marcus was already maneuvering into position. Ground control, I understand the risks, but we're not leaving people behind. The final extraction was the most challenging flying Marcus had done since his military service. He had to maintain a precise hover, while positioning the helicopter so close to the building that the rotor wash was reflecting off the structure and creating even more turbulent air. Every few seconds, wind gusts would try to push the aircraft into the building, and Marcus had to use every technique he had ever learned to maintain control. Kim worked with incredible speed and precision, extracting the trapped survivors one by one from the stairwell window. Marcus could hear her counting over the radio as each person was brought to safety. 12, 13, 14, 15. That's everyone, Commander. All survivors are secure. As Marcus began to lift away from the building with the final group of survivors, he heard Rodriguez's urgent voice on the radio. Dragon 1, get clear immediately. The building engineers are reporting imminent structural failure. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He pulled the helicopter away from the Meridian Tower with maximum power, climbing rapidly to get clear of the danger zone. Behind them, they could hear the groaning sound of stressed steel as the building's upper floors began to buckle from the heat damage. They had gotten everyone out with minutes to spare. As Marcus flew the final group of survivors to the medical staging area, he allowed himself a moment to process what had just happened. In the space of 45 minutes, he had extracted 150 people from certain death, using skills he hadn't employed in 8 years and had never expected to use again. As Marcus landed the helicopter for the final time, he was greeted by a crowd of emergency responders, media personnel, and city officials who had gathered to witness the conclusion of the rescue operation. The Meridian Tower stood behind them, its upper floors now partially collapsed but no longer threatening the lives of anyone inside. All 150 people who had been trapped were safe, receiving medical attention and would survive their ordeal. Chief Sullivan was waiting for Marcus as he climbed out of the helicopter. Her expression showed a mixture of relief, gratitude, and amazement. "Commander Chen," she said, extending her hand, "what you did today was nothing short of miraculous. You saved 150 lives under conditions that would have been impossible for most pilots." Marcus accepted her handshake, but seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what needed to be done. Chief, your people on the ground made it possible. I couldn't have done it without the coordination and support, but the media had already picked up on the story of the mysterious taxi driver who had turned out to be a highly decorated military pilot. News crews surrounded Marcus, shouting questions about his background and his heroic actions. Marcus tried to deflect their attention, saying only that he was glad everyone was safe and that the real heroes were the firefighters and emergency medical personnel who had coordinated the rescue. However, Marcus's attempts to remain anonymous were unsuccessful. Within hours, investigative reporters had uncovered his military service record, his decorations for valor, and the circumstances surrounding his departure from the Navy. The story that emerged painted a picture of a genuine American hero who had been quietly driving a taxi while carrying the weight of a tragic incident from his Lieutenant Morrison. The Coast Guard pilot who had stepped aside to let Marcus take control spoke to reporters about what he had witnessed. "I've been flying for 12 years, he said, and I've never seen anything like what Commander Chen did today. The precision, the skill, the absolute calm under pressure. It was like watching a master artist at work. Those people are alive because of his extraordinary abilities." The survivors and their families began reaching out to thank Marcus personally. Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter had been among those rescued, found Marcus at the yellow cab depot the next morning. "My daughter is alive because of you," she said through tears. "I don't know how to thank someone who gave me back my child." Marcus was deeply moved by these encounters, but they also forced him to confront emotions he had been suppressing for 8 years. Each grateful face reminded him of Sarah Williams and the family she would never have. The praise for his heroism felt hollow when he remembered the one person he hadn't been able to save. The story gained national attention within days. News networks across the country ran features about the hero taxi driver, and Marcus found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted. The Secretary of the Navy called to congratulate him personally and invited him to visit Washington for a ceremony honoring his civilian heroism. Yellow Cab Company was flooded with requests from passengers who specifically wanted to ride with Marcus. Janet Miller, the dispatcher, told reporters, "We always knew there was something special about Marcus, but we never imagined anything like this. He's the most humble hero you'll ever meet." The media attention also brought unexpected contact from Marcus's former military colleagues. His old squadron commander, now Admiral Patricia Hendricks, called to tell him how proud she was of his actions. "Marcus," she said, "what you did in San Francisco shows the same courage and skill that made you one of our finest pilots. Sarah would have been proud of you." That conversation marked a turning point for Marcus. For the first time in 8 years, he was able to talk about Sarah's death with someone who understood both the circumstances and the burden he had carried. Admiral Hendricks helped him realize that his guilt over Sarah's death had been misplaced, that he had done everything possible in an impossible situation, and that his decision to leave the Navy had been driven by grief rather than failure. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in working with military veterans, reached out to offer her services after seeing Marcus's story on the news. Their conversations helped Marcus understand that survivor's guilt was a common response to traumatic incidents, and that his 8 years of self-imposed exile had been a form of punishment he didn't deserve. 3 months after the rescue, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He accepted a position with the San Francisco Fire Department as a specialist in aerial rescue operations. The city had recognized that urban emergencies were becoming more complex and that they needed personnel with Marcus's unique combination of skills and experience. "I spent 8 years running away from who I was," Marcus explained to Chief Sullivan when she offered him the position. "But what happened at the Meridian Tower showed me that my skills can save lives. I think Sarah would want me to use them to help people rather than hide from them." Marcus's first assignment was developing new protocols for urban helicopter rescue operations and training other pilots in the specialized techniques he had used during the Meridian Tower incident. He also worked with the Coast Guard to improve coordination between different agencies during major emergencies. The transition wasn't easy. Marcus had to overcome years of avoiding responsibility for other people's safety and learn to trust his instincts again. But gradually he found that using his skills to help others was healing the wounds that 8 years of driving a taxi had only covered up. 1 year after the rescue, Marcus attended a reunion gathering of the Meridian Tower survivors. The event was held at a downtown hotel, and all 150 people who had been rescued were invited along with their families. Marcus initially hesitated to attend, but Chief Sullivan convinced him that the survivors needed to thank him properly. The evening was emotional for everyone involved. Children who had been saved drew pictures for Marcus, showing helicopters and stick figures representing him as their hero. Business executives who had thought they would never see their families again spoke about how the experience had changed their perspectives on life. Elderly survivors shared stories of the grandchildren they were now able to watch grow up because of Marcus's actions. Near the end of the evening, a young girl named Emma Santos, the same 8-year-old whose mother had thanked Marcus at the cab depot, presented him with a handmade card. Inside, she had written in careful elementary school handwriting, "Thank you, Mr. Marcus, for saving my life. Now I can grow up and maybe save people too like you did." Marcus kept that card on his desk at the fire department, next to the photograph of his old Navy squadron. For the first time in 8 years, he was able to look at Sarah's face in that picture without feeling overwhelming guilt. Instead, he felt something he had almost forgotten: pride in being able to use his skills to protect others. The taxi driver who had lived in the shadows for 8 years was gone. In his place was someone who had learned that heroism wasn't about never making mistakes or never losing anyone. It was about continuing to act with courage and compassion, even after experiencing failure and loss. Marcus Chen had found his way home to himself, and in doing so, he had given 150 people the chance to find their way home to their families. On quiet evenings, when the city was peaceful and the emergency calls were few, Marcus would sometimes think about Sarah and wonder if she knew that her death had not been in vain, that it had led to a man who could save others, not in spite of his past failures, but because of the wisdom they had given him.